In our final recording about Phase 1 of the Chinese Civil War, which lasted from 1927 to 1937, we're going to discuss Mao's Revolutionary War philosophy, which was an extension of his fighting approach to the GMD. For him, the Chinese Civil War wasn't simply about defeating the GMD and gaining control of China in the end. It was about a complete restructuring of Chinese society with a new philosophy in place, which he called Maoism. So it was about indoctrinating the people for them to accept this new way of life and to show them the benefits of it as opposed to the status quo that they were used to for so long. We'll also discuss how Phase 1 came to a final end in 1937 when the Japanese invaded the country of China and started the Sino-Japanese War. At that point, a second united front was formed between the GMD and the CCP to address the greater concern of the Japanese invasion. Once the Japanese were defeated at the end of World War II, the Chinese Civil War resumed in 1946, but we'll discuss that phase, which is Phase 2, in our unit about the origins of the Cold War. So let's take a look at why Mao's revolutionary philosophy was so important to him. If you can look at the bottom of page 266, like I had said in the beginning of the recording, this whole war was not just about defeating the GMD, but also a way to impose a whole new ideology on the people of China. It was similar to what happened in the Russian Revolution. The ideas of Marxism were indoctrinated into the proletariat, which was the working class of Russia, and which is what inspired them to rise up against their aristocratic regime that was in place, the Romanovs, and throw them over and to impose a whole new government style on the country of Russia and actually turn it into a communist state, the USSR. So very similar to what happened here in China, except it used a different support base, in this case, the peasants. If you look at basically his philosophy down here was set up into several stages which went along with his whole tactics of guerrilla warfare. The first phase of setting up base areas, which you can see right here, was all about indoctrination. The peasants would be organized into a base area and then be educated in this communist ideology of Mao, which was a bit different from the Russian model of communism, as we've discussed in class so far. And he was hoping that once these peasants were indoctrinated to his beliefs, that they would be more willing to accept his taxes and other decisions, which he was trying to show them was better than what they had had before this part. So this was all about education and indoctrination. It's kind of similar to if you've ever learned about different leaders of cults in more recent times and how they get such a massive amount of support and following among the people. The people are basically brainwashed, and that's exactly what Mao did to these peasants too. I mean, for them, he presented himself as their only hope for a better life. And so the more that he drilled that into their minds, the more accepting they were of his decisions, whatever they might be. So when he emerged as the final leader of China at the end of the second phase of the Chinese Civil War, nobody really dared to question his rule, because if you did, then your life was at stake. He got their support and belief and used that to his advantage later on as the supreme ruler of China. So that was the first part of this revolutionary warfare ideology, was to gain a base area where the peasants could be indoctrinated. One thing also that you can see if you look at the bottom of 266 and top of 267 was the 8 rules that are mentioned of the CCP army, the Red Army. That was actually one of the sources that we used when we did the document question back on 262 and 263. Document B was those 8 rules, and it was all about gaining the trust and respect of the peasantry. The next phase of his revolutionary warfare was the organization phase. And basically, this was a repetition of setting up the base areas, except this was in new locations. And the whole idea was to slowly take over the countryside by getting these different locations as base areas. So therefore, eventually the countryside would be taken over by the CCP, which would then isolate the cities and allow final political control of the CCP itself. After the organization phase, which would end up in the countryside of China being supportive of the CCP, it was then about defending those bases. Mao knew that the GMD would not stop their attacks and that these bases would be attacked by GMD forces, but he was hoping that the peasants at that point would be trained enough in hit-and-run tactics because of their knowledge of the land and the idea of local support, which we've looked at quite a bit now, that they could effectively go against these GMD fighters. It's kind of similar to the encirclement campaigns where Mao would allow the GMD forces to come into his area, which at that time was the Jiangxi Soviet region, and he would allow the GMD to begin their attacks, and then he would send in CCP units to cut up the GMD forces and separate them from each other and be able to attack them with guerrilla-style tactics, hit and run, and then disappear into the local community. Over time, he was hoping that the GMD fighters would become demoralized because they wouldn't know where or when a CCP attack would come from or what form or shape it would take place in. So it was a way of wearing down the enemy by discouraging them. After this, defending the bases area was the idea of the guerrilla phase, which was basically the idea of creating many more guerrilla fighters whenever the CCP had to retreat. We know that they had to retreat after the 5th Encirclement Campaign. That's when they made that long march over 6,000 miles to their new base of Shaanxi. Along the way, it was a way of showing the local population what they were doing. They were creating more guerrilla fighters in the process. So Mao knew that even though it was bad when they had to retreat from GMD forces, in a way it could be good because this would be a way for them to not only spread the ideology of Maoism, but also to train more guerrilla fighters, which could be used in the final attacks against the GMD. After creating as many guerrilla fighters as possible, it was then about the idea of a protracted war, which is basically what we've discussed before, the concept of a war of attrition. It's a gradual wearing down of the enemy. If you remember from Mao's handbook that we looked at in class when we split apart the 18 tactics, a lot of them were about being cautious with your approach, taking your time, using gradual methods rather than trying to get everything done at once. Mao knew that this war against the GMD would be long. He knew that the GMD had more fighters and they had better weapons. And especially in Phase 2, you'll see that the U.S. came to support the nationalists, the GMD army, with supplies and weaponry. And so Mao knew that in order to defeat that in the end, he had to be willing to accept a very long, drawn-out conflict. So the idea of drawing out the enemy and demoralizing them as much as possible and gaining new guerrilla fighters and training them along the way. He was hoping that the numbers of guerrilla fighters would grow and then therefore the number of attacks on the GMB would grow and finally be able to tilt the war in the favor of the CCP. Finally, the last stage of his revolutionary warfare was all about finishing the efforts that these Red Army fighters had been doing for so long, the idea of seizing power. At this point, it was hoped that all these different guerrilla units that had been created throughout the countryside would come together and then become a conventional fighting force, a conventional army. This is the phase or the stage of warfare that the CCP was in when Phase 2 began in 1946. Phase 1 was basically going about all these other previous steps, like we've seen with the Long March and with the encirclement campaigns. Finally, they were at this point where they had enough guerrilla fighters to launch a conventional army at the beginning of Phase 2. Another reason why they were at this stage in Phase 2 is because of what happened with the war with Japan, which interrupted the two phases of the Chinese Civil War. Finally, let's look at how Phase 1 of the Chinese Civil War came to an end with the emergence of the Second United Front in 1937. We discussed before about the Long March and how at the Zunyi Conference, Mao emerged as the unquestioned legitimate leader of the CCP. Jiang Jieshi knew that Mao had a much greater reputation among the people. He was definitely still wanting to defeat Mao and have the GMD come out as victorious. But one thing that we also mentioned in a previous recording was that Jiang Jieshi had to deal with the Japanese. Jiang Jieshi, after the Northern Expedition, when the warlords were defeated, proclaimed himself and the GMD as the legitimate government of China. And therefore, he saw himself as the one responsible for dealing with the Japanese threat. The Japanese invaded Manchuria in 1931, which was a clear violation of League of Nations protocol. However, the lack of response from the League of Nations allowed the Japanese to further enter the country until it ended up in a full-out war in 1937, when the Japanese fully invaded China. Back in 1931, though, Jiang Jieshi really couldn't do a whole lot about the Japanese threat. He did appeal to the League of Nations, but they were pretty weak and ineffective at that point and weren't willing to force the Japanese to stop their actions. In fact, the Japanese actually withdrew themselves from the League of Nations, thereby showing that they wouldn't cooperate with any League decisions anyways. But there wasn't a whole lot that Jiang Jieshi could do at that point because he still considered the communists to be a greater concern to take care of than the Japanese. If you look at his quote on 267 in the paragraph under the heading that says end of the first stage, it says that Jiang Jieshi said that the Japanese, quote, were a disease of the skin while the communists were a disease of the heart, which shows that he definitely wanted to emerge victorious over the CCP in the end and take full control of China. But he did know that the Japanese were something that had to be dealt with at some point. After invading Manchuria in 1931, the Japanese continued to attack in different locations of China. You can see that they attacked Shanghai, which was a major city in the East Coast in 1932, and they had advanced up to the Great Wall in January of 1933. So obviously we've talked about the idea of foreign involvement and the resentment that the Chinese people had towards any type of foreign involvement, whether it was European, American, or in this case, Japanese. So as the Japanese more and more attacked different locations in China, the people had more and more outrage and wanted to see that stopped. So their attention was kind of drawn away from what was happening between the GMD and the CCP and turned towards the Japanese and wanting to rid that foreign influence from their country. Mao realized this, and him being all about local peasant support, called for another united front between the CCP and the GMD to fight against the Japanese. So this was a very smart move on the part of Mao, because basically he showed that by being willing to cooperate, nobody could dismiss them as being bandits or not for the good of the country. He was clearly showing that he wanted the peasants to back him up in getting rid of the Japanese threats. Comintern officials encouraged this second united front, which they had encouraged the first one as well. At that point, Joseph Stalin was in control of the Soviet Union, and he basically thought that Jiang Jieshi was the stronger one of the two that could take on the Japanese threat. We know that the Soviets eventually joined with the Allies during World War II after the Nazis broke an agreement with them. But the Soviets had a long history with Japan too, even before that point, and he obviously wouldn't want to see the Japanese expand any more than what they were doing. So the Comintern encouragement of the Second United Front is what actually made it happen. Even though Jiang Jieshi was considered the more capable leader, he himself was kidnapped by a warlord, which shows you that the warlord presence was greatly diminished but not quite gone from the country of China. And therefore, I think Comintern and Stalin himself realized that the two forces had to work together in order to make an effective combative force against the Japanese. So if you look at the top of page 268, you can see when the Japanese finally all out invaded the country of China. It was in July of 1937. You can see what happened in the battle for Shanghai, where Jiang Jieshi's forces had to retreat, and their capital was moved, and the Chinese, upon entering that new capital of Nanjing, completely obliterated the local population. It was, in fact, known as the Rape of Nanjing, which we'll discuss again with the events leading up to World War II, but it was just a terrible atrocity and definitely something that you would think of as a total outrage, a genocide, and those actions were something that many Japanese were put on trial for later in the war tribunals after World War II was finished. So the war was officially on from July 1937 to the end of World War II, which was not until 1945. Throughout that whole time, even though the CCP and GMD were cooperating in the Second United Front, they were doing so with ulterior motives in mind. The CCP was hoping that their legitimacy and support would continue to grow, as it already had, and that the war against Japan would wear down the forces of the GMD, because they were still considered the main group that could be capable of carrying out any type of warfare against the Japanese. So Mao was hoping that that could be used to the CCP's advantage if the GMD was worn down throughout the conflict with Japan. This Second United Front was called a national war of resistance against the Japanese, and the Chinese people united behind it to rid their country of this foreign influence. You can see the idea of foreign intervention carried throughout even before the Chinese Civil War started, during it, right here when it was interrupted, and of course in the second phase when both the Soviets and the United States took two different sides in the final conclusion of the Chinese Civil War.